Hi, we're doing another close reading in case you're stuck at home, and this is another one that we read in class, so let's take a look at it. Um, the scene is chapter 19. We're in Bath, pages 128 to 131, a little bit longer of a scene in your book. So the Elliots go into a tea shop, it's a confectionery shop, to get out of the rain, and Anne sees Captain Wentworth out on the street. She sees him through the window. The whole scene is a reversal of the situations we've been in before, where in the past it's always Anne that's been at the disadvantage, and this time the shoe is on the other foot. Let's take a look.
Mr. Elliot was attending his two cousins and Mrs. Clay. They were in Milsom Street. It began to rain, not much, but enough to make shelter desirable for women, and quite enough to make it very desirable for Miss Elliot to have the advantage of being conveyed home in Lady Dalrymple's carriage, which was seen waiting at a little distance. She, Anne, and Mrs. Clay, therefore, turned into Molland's, while Mr. Elliot stepped to Lady Dalrymple to request her assistance. He soon joined them again, successful, of course. Lady Dalrymple would be most happy to take them home, and would call for them in a few minutes. Her ladyship's carriage was a barouche, and did not hold more than 4 with any comfort. Miss Carteret was with her mother. Consequently, it was not reasonable to expect accommodation for all the 3 Camden Place ladies. There could be no doubt as to Miss Elliot. Whoever suffered inconvenience, she must suffer none. But it occupied a little time to settle the point of civility between the other 2. The rain was a mere trifle, and Anne was most sincere in preferring a walk with Mr. Elliot. But the rain was also a mere trifle to Mrs. Clay. She would hardly allow it even to drop at all, and her boots were so thick, much thicker than Miss Anne's, and in short her civility rendered her quite as anxious to be left to walk with Mr. Elliot as Anne could be, and it was discussed between them with a generosity so polite and so determined that the others were obliged to settle it for them, Miss Elliot maintaining that Mrs. Clay had a little cold already, and Mr. Elliot deciding on appeal that his cousin Anne's boots were rather the thickest. It was fixed accordingly that Mrs. Clay should be of the party in the carriage, and they had just reached this point when Anne, as she sat near the window, descried most decidedly and distinctly Captain Wentworth walking down the street.
Okay, so we have this kind of long...
Mr. Elliot was attending his 2 cousins and Mrs.
Sorry, we have this kind of long opening to the scene, and it's set up with this set of interactions between her sister Elizabeth, Miss Elliot. The eldest goes by Miss Elliot, then the next one would be Miss Anne, and Mr. Elliot and Mrs. Clay. So it starts raining, and it says here, I've highlighted, quite enough to make it desirable for Miss Elliot to have the advantage of being conveyed home in Lady Dalrymple's carriage. So in other words, the rain is actually, it's an advantage for her, it's an opportunity for her to get a ride in Lady Dalrymple's carriage, and she's such a suck-up to Lady Dalrymple. This is a good opportunity for her to flex that way. And so the carriage is too small, so only 2 of them get to fit in. And I love how there could be no doubt as to Miss Elliot. Again, the self-assuredness and self-centeredness of her older sister is absolute. It's unquestioned. So then the question becomes, which of them is going to ride with her? Is it going to be Mrs. Clay, or is it going to be Anne? And you can see that when Anne kind of says, well, I'd rather prefer to walk, Mrs. Clay has to be, well, I prefer to walk. And you can hear in the way it was read that she would hardly allow it to drop at all, how excessive she is. This little scene reminds me of these 2 guys. I don't know if you know these chipmunks from the Looney Tunes cartoons. Their names are actually Macintosh, I found out. But anyway, I couldn't think of it. No, after you, please. They're doing this thing, but one of the things you notice is that Anne doesn't want to be stuck in a carriage with her sister and Lady Dalrymple. We know she doesn't like Lady Dalrymple, and she'd rather walk with Mr. Elliot. Is Mrs. Clay just being perhaps, the suck up that she usually is, and she always wants to take it on? We don't know. But the one thing we do know is that that is Elizabeth and Mr. Elliot end the scene. Miss Elliot, Elizabeth says, yeah, she's always going to go for favor of Mrs. Clay, and Mr. Elliot is going to prefer walking with Anne. But then we find out the whole point of the scene isn't all that nonsense in the first place. It's that Captain Wentworth is out on the street, walking down the street. So it shifts the whole focus of the scene.
Her start was perceptible only to herself, but she instantly felt that she was the greatest simpleton in the world, the most unaccountable and absurd. For a few minutes she saw nothing before her. It was all confusion. She was lost. And when she had scolded back her senses, she found the others still waiting for the carriage, and Mr. Elliot, always obliging, just setting off for Union Street on a commission of Mrs. Clay's. She now felt a great inclination to go to the outer door. She wanted to see if it rained. Why was she to suspect herself of another motive? Captain Wentworth must be out of sight. She left her seat and would go. One half of her should not be always so much wiser than the other half, or always suspecting the other of being worse than it was. She would see if it rained. She was sent back, however, in a moment by the entrance of Captain Wentworth himself, among a party of gentlemen and ladies, evidently his acquaintances, and whom he must have joined a little below Milsom Street. He was more obviously struck and confused by the sight of her than she had ever observed before. He looked quite red. For the first time since their renewed acquaintance, she felt that she was betraying the least sensibility of the two. She had the advantage of him in the preparation of the last few moments. All the overpowering, blinding, bewildering first effects of strong surprise were over with her. Still, however, she had enough to feel. It was agitation, pain, pleasure, a something between delight and misery. He spoke to her and then turned away. The character of his manner was embarrassment. She could not have called it either cold or friendly or anything so certainly as embarrassed. Her start was...
Okay, so in this scene, we see once again, she sees Captain Wentworth, and we start with her kind of having this indistinct thousand feelings rushing on her. She saw nothing. It was all confusion. She was lost. It's like she's suddenly in a fog. When she scolds back, her senses comes back to the present. Everything is unchanged. Everybody's still waiting. So then she figures, okay, I need to see him again. And she has this great little scene where, I don't know if you've ever been in this situation, where she's trying to convince herself that it's reasonable to go and see if it's still raining. Why else would I go to see? And I don't always suspect myself. Obviously, she really wants to go see if Captain Wentworth is out there, but she's not willing to admit that to herself. This is the kind of argument she's having with herself. But then Captain Wentworth himself comes in. And the thing that's interesting here is he's the one who's more struck and confused. For the first time, she felt she was betraying the least sensitivity. And it mentions the overpowering, blinding, bewildering first effect of strong surprise were over with her. And it uses her own surprise to kind of narrate his surprise, showing that he still does have these adjectives, overpowering, blinding, bewildering, that he still has those first effects. Even though it's really narrating her. The final part here on this page, this gives her this opportunity for the first time to really look at him and really notice his reaction. He's turned away from her, and now he is the one observed rather than the observer, and she thinks about what am I seeing? The character of his manner was embarrassment. She could not have called it either colder. This isn't the narrator telling us it's embarrassment. It's her thinking it through. She couldn't have called it either cold or friendly or anything so certainly as embarrassment. She notices his embarrassment. So again, we've got this reversal here where he's the one who's surprised, who can't talk, who has to turn away, and she is sizing him up and seeing what she thinks of him.
After a short interval, however, he came towards her and spoke again. Mutual inquiries on common subjects passed, neither of them probably much the wiser for what they heard, and Anne continuing fully sensible of his being less at ease than formerly. They had, by dint of being so very much together, got to speak to each other with a considerable portion of apparent indifference and calmness, but he could not do it now. Time had changed him, or Louisa had changed him. There was consciousness of some sort or other. He looked very well, not as if he had been suffering in health or spirits, and he talked of Upper Cross, of the Musgroves, nay, even of Louisa, and had even a momentary look of his own arch significance as he named her. But yet it was Captain Wentworth, not comfortable, not easy, not able to feign that he was. It did not surprise, but it grieved Anne to observe that Elizabeth would not know him. She saw that he saw Elizabeth, that Elizabeth saw him, that there was complete internal recognition on each side. She was convinced that he was ready to be acknowledged as an acquaintance, expecting it, and she had the pain of seeing her sister turn away with unalterable coldness. Lady Dalrymple's carriage, for which Miss Elliot was growing very impatient, now drew up. The servant came to announce it. It was beginning to rain again, and altogether there was a delay and a bustle and a talking, which must make all the little crowd in the shop understand that Lady Dalrymple was calling to convey Miss Elliot. At last Miss Elliot and her friend, unattended but by the servant, for there was no cousin returned, were walking off, and Captain Wentworth, watching them, turned again to Anne, and by manner rather than words was offering his services to her.
Okay. So, Okay, so in this section, they start to have a little talk, and then things start to move again. So in the first paragraph on the page here, one of the things we have here is that we have this conversation, but what they talk about is unimportant. It's the way they understand each other. It's the fact that that she's paying attention to what he's like. She's very fully sensible of his being less at ease than formerly. So she does have, her senses are aware of him. He talked of Uppercross, of the Musgroves, and even of Louisa, and had even a momentary look of his own arch significance. So we know what things he's talking about, but it's the way he's talking, it's the things she sees in him that are narrated here. This particular kind of narration is something that 70 years later, 85 years later, somewhere in there, Henry James is going to be writing just around the turn of the 20th century novels, and he's a very brainiac kind of writer, where he's perfecting this way of writing, but she's already doing it, where he's narrating a conversation where he doesn't even talk about what was said, but rather uses a lot of metaphor to express the way they felt as they said it. This is what she's already doing. She's not narrating what they're saying, she's narrating their feelings as they say it. That's really radical, and it's something that's going to take a better part of a century for other writers to catch up with. Again, this is the part we're seeing here. Less at ease, there's consciousness. One of the things she doesn't know is it Louisa that's changed him? Is he actually in love with her? She's got a mystery that she's trying to figure out here. We bring in Elizabeth. Elizabeth would not know him, this whole thing where she refuses to recognize him. By bringing in the rest of the family, we can switch it up now. So Jane Austen brings these characters back in to kind of break up their little conversation and put other things into motion. Elizabeth doing her thing. She makes all the little crowd in the shop understand. She makes enough noise that everybody can notice that she's having Lady Dalrymple pick her up because she wants that kind of attention. And Captain Wentworth sees them all go, and again, it's not even spoken. He's offering his services to her to walk her home.
"I'm much obliged to you," was her answer, "but I'm not going with them. The carriage would not accommodate so many. I walk. I prefer walking." "But it rains." "Oh, very little. Nothing that I regard." After a moment's pause, he said, "Though I came only yesterday, I have equipped myself properly for Bath already, you see," pointing to a new umbrella. "I wish you would make use of it if you're determined to walk, though I think it would be more prudent to let me get you a chair." She was very much obliged to him, but declined it all, repeating her conviction that the rain would come to nothing at present, and adding, "I'm only waiting for Mr. Elliot. He will be here in a moment, I'm sure." She had hardly spoken the words when Mr. Elliot walked in. Captain Wentworth recollected him perfectly. There was no difference between him and the man who had stood on the steps at Lyme, admiring Anne as she passed, except in the air and look and manner of the privileged relation and friend. He came in with eagerness, appeared to see and think only of her, apologized for his stay, was grieved to have kept her waiting, and anxious to get her away without further loss of time and before the rain increased. And in another moment they walked off together, her arm under his, a gentle and embarrassed glance and a "good morning to you" being all that she had time for as she passed away.
Okay. So, in this part here, this is the first time we get actual conversation between them. She's very direct. I prefer walking. This is the first time we get actually, not the fact, first time they have conversation, but the first time we see their speech. Notice that she's very direct. I prefer walking, nothing that I regard, very little. Notice how awkward his speech is. I came only yesterday. I've equipped myself properly. He's a little formal, a little stiff, a little awkward, especially compared with her directness. And then she brings up, "I'm only waiting." Here's where she sticks the knife in. "I'm only waiting for Mr. Elliot. He'll be here in a moment." And then in comes Mr. Elliot. Captain Wentworth, of course, has seen Mr. Elliot in Lyme. He saw Mr. Elliot making eyes at Anne, but now he sees that he knows Anne, the privileged relation and friend. So he's like seeing this rival all of a sudden step in front of him. The very next thing we get is another of these brilliant long sentences which rushes her out the door. He comes in, he appears to see and think only of her, blah, blah, blah. He's anxious to get her away. Another moment they walked off together, her arm under his, and all she has time for is "good morning to you," and whoosh, out the door. This is the kind of thing we've seen, the sentences like this again and again used when things happen to Anne that get rushed onto her or get her rushed out of a place, or something happens around her and she's left to deal with it. Now the person being left to deal with it is Captain Wentworth, and we'll see what happens to kind of stick that in further.
As soon as they were out of sight, the ladies of Captain Wentworth's party began talking of them. "Mr. Elliot does not dislike his cousin, I fancy." "Oh, no, that's clear enough. One can guess what will happen there. He's always with them. Half lives in the family, I believe. What a very good-looking man." "Yes, and Miss Atkinson, who dined with him once at the Wallaces, says he's the most agreeable man she ever was in company with." "She's pretty, I think, Anne Elliot. Very pretty when one comes to look at her. It is not the fashion to say so, but I confess I admire her more than her sister." "Oh, so do I." "And so do I, no comparison. But the men are all wild after Miss Elliot. Anne is too delicate for them."
Okay, so in this one, we begin now at the very end. He's overhearing all his friends now talking about them. The first thing they say is they can all see that Mr. Elliot likes Anne, and everybody says nice things about how good looking he is. He's agreeable. We can see, one can guess what's going to happen there, that they're likely to get married. And then moving on, and this is to me very interesting, is that they start praising Anne. These are just strangers. They're just people in Bath. Of course, everybody talks about everybody there. But they think she's prettier than her sister. This is the first time we've heard anybody kind of value her more than they value her sister, more than they value her family. And this is sort of the general opinion. Of course, Wentworth has to overhear this. He's put exactly in the position that we've seen Anne put in again and again, where he has to kind of think about it and chew on it. Anne hasn't yet figured out what Captain Wentworth thinks, and you'll see in chapter 20 she still has to figure out, what does he feel about Louisa? Is he heartbroken about Louisa? And by the end of chapter 20 she's figured out, oh, it's that he's jealous of Mr. Elliot, and that's when she figures out that he loves her, and now she only has to figure out how to get him to know that she loves him too. That'll be the end of this one. I know it's a long passage, but I just wanted to walk through and show all the different things going on. Very carefully constructed passage that Austen puts together.